This happened about 4 years ago. Me and my friend Danny were doing a road trip down to Florida from Pennsylvania. We had been planning it for months and we finally had the time and money lined up to actually commit to it. We left on a Friday night after Danny got off work, thinking we'd drive through the night and save money on a hotel. I drove the first stretch, Danny drove the second, and by sometime early Saturday morning we were deep into Georgia on some 2-lane state road we had gotten redirected onto because of construction on the interstate. Danny was behind the wheel at this point, and I was half asleep in the passenger seat. I wasn't fully out, but I wasn't really paying attention either. I remember hearing the engine start making a sound, and then Danny saying something under his breath. I sat up and asked him what was wrong, and he said the temperature gauge was climbing, and that something wasn't right. He pulled off onto the shoulder and cut the engine. We got out and opened the hood, and there was steam coming up from somewhere near the radiator. Neither of us know much about cars beyond the basics. We knew it wasn't good, and we knew we weren't driving it anywhere until it cooled down at least. It was around 4 in the morning, completely dark, no houses or lights visible anywhere nearby, and no service on either of our phones. We stood there on the side of that road for probably 20 minutes before a truck finally came by. It slowed down and pulled over about 50 feet ahead of us. A man got out and walked back toward us. He looked like he was in his 60s, tall and thin, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He asked what happened, and Danny explained the situation. The man looked under the hood for a minute and told us the radiator hose had a crack and that we weren't going to be able to drive it. He said there was a town about 12 miles down the road and that there was a garage there that opened early. He offered to drive us into town so we could call for a tow in the morning. We didn't have a lot of options, so we thanked him and got in. His truck was one of those older extended cab models. Me and Danny both sat in the back. There was stuff piled on the front passenger seat, tools and a couple of plastic bins, so there wasn't really room for either of us up front anyway. He introduced himself as Earl and seemed friendly enough. He asked us where we were headed, and we told him Florida. He asked what part, and we told him. He nodded and said he used to drive down that way for work a long time ago. The conversation was normal. Nothing seemed off. I remember thinking how lucky we were that someone had stopped because that road was completely dead at that hour. It wasn't until maybe 5 or 6 minutes into the drive that I started noticing things. The first thing was a woman's shoe sitting in the footwell behind the passenger seat. Just one shoe, a sandal. It stood out to me because everything else in the truck was work stuff, tools, rope, a tarp folded up near the rear window. I didn't say anything about it. I told myself it was probably his wife's or his daughter's, and it just ended up back there. Not a big deal by itself. I looked over at Danny, but he was looking out the window and hadn't noticed. The second thing was that when we passed under a streetlight and I could see into the front a little better, I noticed the plastic bin on the passenger seat had some kind of dark staining on it that looked old, like something had dried on the outside of it a long time ago. I couldn't tell what it was. I stared at it for a few seconds and then looked away because I didn't want Earl to catch me looking. I nudged Danny with my elbow and he glanced over at me. I tilted my head slightly toward the front seat and he looked up. I don't know exactly what he saw, but he turned back to me with a look that told me he felt it too. Something was wrong and we couldn't exactly talk about it with Earl sitting 3 feet in front of us. Earl started asking us more specific questions. What hotel were we staying at in Florida? How long were we planning to be there? Whether we were meeting people or just the two of us. I answered as vaguely as I could and tried to keep changing the subject. He didn't push it, but the questions themselves felt strange, like he was collecting information rather than just making conversation to pass the time. Danny very quietly said he had to use the bathroom and asked how much further it was. Earl said maybe another 5 or 6 miles. Danny put his hand flat on my leg for just a second and pressed down. That was enough for me to understand that he was thinking the same thing I was, and that we needed to find a reason to get out of that truck. I told Earl that if it wasn't too much trouble, we'd appreciate it if he could pull over at any gas station or lit area before town because we both really needed to stretch our legs. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said the town was the closest thing with a bathroom. I said that was fine and that we could wait. I just wanted him to stop somewhere with other people and lights and cameras. He did pull into a gas station about 2 miles later. It was one of those small ones that was technically open 24 hours but barely staffed at that hour. Just one person visible behind the counter through the window. We got out and thanked Earl and told him we'd be fine from here and could call a tow from inside. He sat in the truck for a minute without pulling away. I didn't look back at him. I just walked straight through the door with Danny right behind me. The woman behind the counter looked half asleep. I asked if we could use the phone and explained that our car had broken down. She slid a cordless phone across the counter without saying much. I stood there with my back to the window while Danny made the call. After maybe 2 or 3 minutes, Danny said quietly that Earl had finally pulled away. We both just stood there for a minute. We got a tow about an hour later and spent the rest of the day waiting on the car at the garage in town. We never found out anything about Earl or whether our instincts about him were right. It could have been completely innocent. It could have been an old man who was genuinely just trying to help 2 stranded guys on the side of the road in the middle of the night. Maybe the shoe was his daughter's. Maybe the stain on the bin was paint or motor oil. But I know what I felt sitting in that truck, and I know what Danny felt, and neither of us talked about it for the rest of the trip. We just wanted to get to Florida and forget about it. I think about that drive more than I'd like to admit though, especially the part where he just sat in that parking lot not pulling away, just sitting there watching us through the glass. I was 29 at the time, and I had just taken a new job across the country. Rather than flying out and shipping everything, I decided to load up my car and make the drive myself. It was something I had always wanted to do, and I figured this was probably the best excuse I was ever going to get to actually do it. I mapped out a rough route, packed what I could fit into the back of my Jeep Cherokee, and left on a Tuesday morning in late October. The drive was supposed to take about 3 days depending on how many stops I made and how hard I pushed each day. The first day was completely normal, long and tiring like any long drive is, but nothing out of the ordinary. I stopped at a few rest areas, grabbed food at a truck stop, and checked into a motel outside of St. Louis around 9 p.m. that night. I slept fine, woke up early, and got back on the road. The second day is where things started feeling off. I was maybe 4 or 5 hours into driving when I pulled into a rest stop off the interstate somewhere in Missouri. I don't remember the exact mile marker, but I remember it was one of those larger rest stops with the big brick building and the dog walking areas off to the side. It was around midday, so there were a decent amount of cars there, families getting out to stretch, truck drivers doing the same. Nothing unusual about it at all. I used the restroom, filled up my water bottle at the fountain, and walked back to my car. And while I was unlocking the door, I noticed a man standing near the picnic tables maybe 30 feet away. He was just standing there facing in my direction. Not sitting, not eating, not on his phone, just standing with both hands at his sides looking toward where I was parked. He looked like he was probably in his late 40s or early 50s, heavy set, dark jacket, jeans. Nothing particularly alarming about him except that he was just completely still, in a way that people at rest stops usually aren't. I figured he was probably just waiting for someone to come out of the building or something like that. I got in my car and drove off. About 2 hours later, I stopped at a gas station just off the highway to fill up and grab something to eat. It was one of those bigger travel centers with a subway inside and a bunch of trucks in the back. I pumped my gas, went inside, stood in line and ordered a sandwich, and brought it back to the car to eat before getting back on the road. I was sitting in the driver's seat eating when I looked up through the windshield and saw a man walking across the parking lot toward the entrance of the travel center. Same dark jacket, same heavy-set build, same age. I told myself it was probably just someone who looked similar, and that I was still thinking about the guy from the rest stop earlier, because nothing else had happened, and there was no real reason to be concerned. People take the same highway. People stop at the same places. That's just how road trips work. I finished eating and got back on the road. I didn't think about it again for another couple of hours until I stopped at another rest stop to use the bathroom and walk around for a few minutes because I was starting to feel that foggy tiredness that comes from sitting in a car for too long. This rest stop was smaller than the first one, maybe a dozen cars, a few families, a couple of motorcycles, and a semi-parked way in the back. I walked around, used the bathroom, and came back outside. I was standing near my car doing a few stretches when I looked over toward the far end of the parking lot and felt my stomach drop completely. The man was there, same jacket, same posture. He was standing near the edge of the lot where the grass started, facing my direction, not doing anything, just standing there watching. This time I didn't write it off. I got in my car as fast as I could and pulled out. I checked my mirrors constantly for the next several miles, expecting to see a car following me, but I didn't see anything that stood out. I tried to convince myself there was some normal explanation for it. Maybe he was working some kind of highway monitoring job or something. Maybe he just happened to be making the same drive and taking the same stops. I knew how unlikely that was, but I needed a reason that wasn't the other thing my brain kept going back to. Around 7 that evening, I stopped at a motel to check in for the night. I was somewhere in Kansas at that point. I pulled into the parking lot, grabbed my bag from the back, and walked into the lobby. The woman at the desk had me checked in within a few minutes, handed me my key, and pointed me toward the end of the building where my room was. I walked back outside to move my car closer, and that's when I noticed a dark-colored sedan parked at the far end of the lot with nobody in it. I stood there looking at it for a second. I couldn't tell if it was the same car, because I had never actually seen what car the man was driving. I went to my room, locked the door, and pushed the chain lock across even though the deadbolt was already on. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while just thinking about the whole thing. I went back and forth about whether I was just getting paranoid from too many hours alone in a car. That happens. Long drives mess with your head a little. But 3 stops in a row was hard to explain away. I ended up texting my friend back home and telling him what had been happening, mostly just to say it out loud to someone. He told me I was probably just tired and seeing patterns that weren't there. I wanted to believe that. About an hour later, maybe a little after 8, I heard footsteps outside my room. That alone wasn't unusual. It was a motel. People walk around, but they stopped right outside my door. I sat there completely still and waited. Then I heard someone try the door handle. Not a knock, just the handle pressing down slowly and then releasing. I grabbed my phone off the bed and stood up. I pressed myself against the wall next to the door and waited. Nothing happened for maybe 20 seconds, and then I heard the footsteps move away down the walkway. I called the front desk immediately and told the woman what happened. She said she would have someone walk the lot. About 10 minutes later, she called me back and said everything looked fine outside and nobody suspicious was around. She asked if I wanted to switch rooms, and I told her no because I had no idea if that would even help if someone already knew which room I was in. I stayed up most of that night. Every sound outside made me tense up. Around 3 in the morning, I finally passed out from pure exhaustion. I woke up early and left before 6. I pushed hard that day and made it to my destination by that evening without stopping anywhere more than I had to. I never saw the man again, and I have no actual proof that any of those 3 sightings were even the same person. But 3 stops on the same stretch of highway in the same day, all with someone matching the same description standing there watching me. And then a door handle being tested at the motel that same night. I don't know how to put all of that together into something that makes sense. I still don't. My name is Ryan and I'm 34. This happened about 2 years ago on a solo road trip I took from Ohio down to Tennessee to visit my older brother who had moved there the year before. It was a straightforward drive, mostly interstate, maybe 7 hours with stops. Nothing about it should have been unusual. About 4 hours in, I missed an exit and didn't realize it for probably 15 minutes. By the time I figured out what happened, I had gotten myself onto a back road that my GPS was having trouble recalculating from, because the signal kept cutting in and out. I wasn't panicking about it. Missing an exit and ending up on a back road isn't exactly a crisis. I figured I'd just follow whatever route the GPS eventually gave me and get back on the highway from there. The road I ended up on was the kind of road that doesn't feel like it belongs to any particular place. No lane markings, old cracked asphalt, trees close on both sides. I drove on it for maybe 10 minutes before I came into what I can only describe as a small town. And I say small, but it was more like a handful of buildings clustered together at a crossroads. A gas station on one corner, a small diner next to it, what looked like an old hardware store across the road, and a few other structures I couldn't really identify. There were maybe 4 or 5 vehicles parked around the area, and a couple of people visible outside. I decided to stop at the gas station since I was getting a little low anyway. I pulled in and got out to pump. There was an older man sitting in a chair just outside the door of the station looking in my direction. I nodded at him, and he didn't nod back. He just watched me. I started pumping the gas and noticed 2 men leaning against a pickup truck at the far side of the lot looking over at me. Not talking to each other, not on their phones, just watching. I kept my head down and focused on the pump. The pump was one of those old ones with no screen and no card reader. You had to go inside to pay. I finished pumping, wrote down the amount from the dial, and walked inside. The man behind the counter was probably 70, heavy, gray hair, and he looked at me the same way the man outside had. Not hostile exactly, but not neutral either, like he was deciding something about me. I told him how much gas I pumped and handed him cash. He made change without saying anything. I asked him if he knew a good way to get back to the interstate from here, and he told me to just follow the main road east for about 8 miles and I'd hit it. I thanked him and walked back out. The 2 men at the pickup were still watching me. The older man in the chair hadn't moved. I got in my car and pulled out. I followed the road east like the man told me. After a couple of minutes, I passed a few houses on either side of the road. At one of them, there was a man standing in the driveway just watching my car go by. Not doing yard work, not getting into a vehicle, just standing there looking. A little further up there was a woman on a porch doing the same thing. I know people stand in their driveways and sit on their porches all the time, but it felt like every single person I passed on that road was watching specifically for my car and had somehow been told I was coming. Then in my rearview mirror, I noticed a pickup truck had pulled onto the road behind me. It was keeping a steady distance, maybe 5 or 6 car lengths back. Not close enough to be aggressive, but close enough that I was aware of it. I sped up slightly to see what would happen, and it stayed at the same distance, which meant it had sped up too. I told myself it was probably just someone from that area, going the same direction. That was the logical answer. But I had been on that road for several minutes, and there were no houses or driveways ahead that I could see. The road was just that, a road, trees on both sides, and nothing else. I watched the truck in my mirror for a while. It never came closer and never fell back, always that same distance. I got my phone out and checked the GPS signal. Still spotty, but I could see the interstate coming up in about 3 or 4 more miles. I kept driving at a normal speed, watched the mirror, and tried to stay calm. About a mile out from where the GPS showed the interstate, I came up on a stop sign at a T intersection and realized I needed to turn right. I put on my turn signal and slowed down. The pickup truck slowed down too. I made the turn, and the truck made the same turn. At that point, the interstate was close enough that I could actually see it over the tree line, and I just focused on getting to it. I merged onto the ramp and accelerated. I looked in my mirror, expecting to see the truck do the same thing, but it didn't. It had stopped at the intersection and just stayed there. I watched in my mirror as I moved further away, and it just sat there at that stop sign, not turning, not going anywhere, until I couldn't see it anymore. I've turned that whole drive over in my head more times than I can count. Every single person on that road stopping to look as I went past. The people at the gas station, the truck that followed me to the exact point where it no longer needed to follow. Maybe all of it was coincidence. Maybe it's just one of those areas where a stranger's car is unusual enough that people notice. I genuinely don't know, but I haven't taken a back road through an area I don't know since that trip. I stick to the interstate now, and if I miss my exit, I just drive to the next one and add the extra time. Some detours aren't worth taking.